In the last episode, we explored one of the most famous near-death experiences ever recorded, that of Pam Reynolds, the woman whose brain was completely shut down during surgery, and yet somehow she remained aware. She saw, she heard, she experienced. And her case left materialist science scrambling for an explanation. But what if Pam's experience wasn't an isolated anomaly? What if it was part of a much bigger pattern? One that challenges everything we think we know about consciousness and the nature of death. Enter Dutch cardiologist Pim van Lommel, a man who had seen far too many patients come back from clinical death with memories that defied medical explanation. He wanted to know, were these accounts just hallucinations, or was something much deeper happening? By the mid-1980s, van Lommel had been practicing long enough to realize that near-death experiences simply didn't fit within the materialist model. Time and time again, he revived patients who, by all scientific standards, should have experienced nothing at all, no perception, no memory, no awareness. And yet, when some of them returned, they described something profound. This led van Lommel on a groundbreaking journey, one that would ultimately result in one of the most important scientific studies ever conducted on near-death experiences. In this episode, we're diving into that 10-year study, its startling findings, and what it tells us about the true nature of consciousness. Let's begin. The year is 1986, and Pim van Lommel begins informally asking all the cardiac arrest survivors who attend his outpatient clinic if they had any memories of the period during which they were clinically dead. To his surprise, of the 50 survivors he talked to over the next 2 years, 12 of them, a staggering 24%, reported an NDE. That number stopped him in his tracks. If nearly 1 in 4 of his revived patients was having this experience, then NDEs weren't just rare, isolated anomalies. They were common, far too common to be dismissed as hallucinations or random brain activity. And if they were happening while the brain was completely non-functional, then the idea that the brain was the sole generator of consciousness was suddenly on very shaky ground. These patients told him that they had been conscious while they were clinically dead. They described floating above their bodies, watching as the doctors and nurses worked frantically to revive them. They recalled conversations held in the operating room, later repeating them word for word. If consciousness ceased when the brain shut down, then these experiences should not be happening. Something was missing from the medical model, and van Lommel wanted to find out what. A proper scientific study was needed, one that would be rigorous, controlled, and large-scale. So in 1988, van Lommel launched a decade-long study into near-death experiences, setting the gold standard for NDE research. His study spanned 10 hospitals in the Netherlands, enrolling 344 cardiac arrest survivors, all of whom had been clinically dead but were successfully resuscitated. Each patient was interviewed within days of their revival. The results? 62 people, 18%, reported a near-death experience. And this wasn't just a matter of faulty memory or confusion. Their brains had been completely offline, yet they returned with stories more vivid and meaningful than anything they had ever experienced in life. But here's where van Lommel's study went a step further than any NDE research that had come before. Rather than just documenting the experiences, he decided to track his patients over time. He wanted to see whether these encounters with death had lasting effects, whether they were just momentary, dreamlike episodes or true life-changing events. So he followed up 2 years later, and then again 8 years later. At each stage, his team conducted in-depth interviews, looking for patterns, changes in personality, belief systems, values, and behaviors. What they found was remarkable. Those who had experienced an NDE were profoundly transformed, in ways that were both immediate and long-lasting. Compared to the control group who had not experienced an NDE, these individuals reported a dramatically reduced fear of death. They no longer saw death as an end, but as a continuation of life in a non-physical dimension. They became more emotionally open, far more comfortable expressing love, gratitude, and joy. They were also more accepting of others, finding themselves less judgmental and more compassionate. Their relationships deepened. They grew more interested in spirituality and the meaning of life, though, interestingly, they showed far less interest in organized religion. It was as if they had touched something bigger than dogma, something direct and undeniable. Materialism, money, power, and status? Suddenly unimportant. Many reported that they no longer cared about material success or societal expectations. Instead, they became drawn to nature, the environment, and social justice, anything that aligned with the interconnectedness they had felt on the other side. And then there was something else, something even stranger. Over time, many of the NDE survivors reported experiencing heightened psychic abilities, clairvoyance, precognition, and an uncanny ability to sense the emotions and even thoughts of others. They described suddenly knowing when someone was about to die, or having visions of future events that later came true. Even weirder, they found that electronic devices often malfunctioned in their presence. Watches stopped working, computers glitched, and checkout scanners inexplicably froze whenever they were near. None of this made sense under the materialist model of reality. And yet these effects weren't temporary. The longer Van Lommel studied these individuals, the stronger these changes became. Instead of fading over time, they intensified, a finding that baffled even the researchers. Van Lommel himself was stunned by what he uncovered. He had expected that the transformations reported by NDE survivors might diminish with time, gradually being reabsorbed into the normal flow of life. Instead, the opposite happened. The experiences only seemed to grow in significance, reshaping lives in ways that were irreversible. In his final analysis, Van Lommel reached a striking conclusion. The near-death experience is not just a brief, unusual event, it is a doorway to a radically new understanding of consciousness. For decades, mainstream science had insisted that consciousness was a byproduct of the brain, a fragile, fleeting phenomenon that disappeared the moment neurons stopped firing. But his study suggested something far more profound. If people could think, see, hear, and remember events in heightened detail while their brains were completely shut down, then consciousness was clearly not confined to the brain. It was something more, something bigger, something independent of the physical body. And that, he realized, changed everything. For materialist science, this was an inconvenient discovery, one that simply should not be possible. But Van Lommel was a scientist. He didn't choose the data, he followed it. And the data pointed to one unavoidable truth. Consciousness continues beyond death. And if that's the case, then we have to ask, what comes next? Because if Van Lommel was right, then the moment we take our last breath is not the end. It's only the beginning. If there's one thing we can say for sure about near-death experiences, it's this: they are life-changing. Whether a person experiences only a fleeting moment of light and peace, or a full, elaborate journey through another dimension, they never return the same. But what exactly happens during an NDE? What are the defining elements that keep showing up time and time again in reports from all over the world? Pim van Lommel, building on the groundbreaking work of psychiatrist Raymond Moody, assessed the depth of each NDE using a 12-point scale. This scale wasn't a rigid formula. Most experiencers didn't report all 12 elements, and every NDE was unique, but there was an unmistakable pattern. No matter where or when the NDE occurred, these elements kept repeating. Van Lommel found that the more of these elements a person experienced, the more profound and transformative their NDE became. And despite some cultural differences, such as indigenous peoples in North America and Australia reporting fewer tunnel experiences and panoramic life reviews, the core structure of the NDE remained the same worldwide. So let's take a tour of what happens when you die, and come back. First, there's the sense that words simply aren't enough. People struggle to put into language what they've just been through. In a flash, their pain disappears. If they died in a car accident, if they suffered a massive heart attack, if their body was crushed or broken, it doesn't matter. The moment consciousness is freed from the body, there is no pain. Then comes the realization that they are dead. Sometimes this realization comes immediately. Other times there's confusion. After all, they still feel like themselves, and their conscious awareness is sharper than ever. Next, there's the out-of-body experience. They find themselves floating above their physical body, watching the scene unfold as doctors work frantically to revive them. Some try to communicate, to tell the doctors, "Hey, I'm fine, stop fussing," but quickly realize no one can hear them. Then they feel a pull towards something else, toward a pinpoint of light. Many describe traveling through a tunnel, though not all experience this. Some pass through a dark void, and while most feel completely at peace, a small percentage remain in the darkness, frightened and alone. But for those who do reach the light, an incredible new reality awaits them, colors they've never seen before. A world of indescribable beauty. Some hear music, the kind that vibrates through their being rather than simply being heard. And then they see people. Sometimes they meet deceased loved ones, a grandmother, a sibling, a best friend who passed too soon. Others encounter beings of light, radiating unconditional love and acceptance. These beings seem to possess immense wisdom, and through a kind of instantaneous telepathic communication, they reveal deep knowledge to the ND ear. Then, something extraordinary happens. The panoramic life review begins. It's as if every single event of their life, every action, every thought, every emotion plays out all at once. But there's no judgment, no punishment, just understanding. They don't just relive their own experiences either. They feel the impact they had on others. If they hurt someone, they experience that person's pain. If they showed love, they feel that love returned. Some are even given a glimpse of the future, not in a rigid, deterministic way, but as if they are being shown possibilities, a path they might walk if they return. But then the barrier appears. Every NDer understands instinctively that this is the point of no return. If they cross it, they will not go back. And just when they're beginning to think, maybe I'll stay, something happens. They are told it's not their time. Sometimes the message comes from a loved one, sometimes from the being of light. Sometimes they are simply pushed back, like Pam Reynolds, whose uncle literally shoved her back into her body. The return is jarring. Many describe feeling like they were sucked back into their body, or like they had dived into a pool of ice water. Pain, which had been completely absent during the NDE, floods back instantly. Many feel angry or disappointed. Why bring them back when they had experienced something so profoundly beautiful? Now let's take a closer look at some of these 12 elements. One of the most consistent things NDEers say is this: there are no words to describe what happened. It's not just that the experience was intense, it's that language itself is too coarse to capture it. Time, for example, doesn't behave the way it does here. During an NDE, everything happens at once, yet it all makes perfect sense. There's no confusion, no disorientation, just a total understanding of everything all at once. But when they return, they have to explain it using words, and words only work in linear time. This creates a deep frustration. Some try to describe what they saw, only to give up, shaking their heads. It's just too much for human words, they say. Seth commented on this exact problem when describing simultaneous time. How difficult it is to explain a timeless reality to beings who must take time to understand the explanation. And it's not just time that behaves differently. Movement does too. There's no need for walking or flying. Just thinking about a place or person instantly transports you there. Many NDEers report that the moment they thought of a loved one, they were immediately by their side. Many NDEers don't realize they're dead at first. Everything feels so normal. They still have thoughts, emotions, memories, but their body is lying lifeless beneath them. Some try to re-enter their bodies, a process that Seth says can cause panic for those who identified too strongly with their physical form in life. Those who hated their body often find themselves strangely drawn to it, while those who had a healthier perspective find it easier to let go. For most, however, the realization that they are dead is not frightening. If anything, it feels liberating. The weird thing, one NDEer told Van Lommel, is that I wasn't surprised at all. I just thought, oh, okay, I'm dead now. This is one of the most profound takeaways from NDE research. Death is not what we think it is. Consciousness does not flicker out. Instead, it expands. So, what does all of this tell us? It tells us that our understanding of consciousness is still deeply incomplete. It tells us that our experiences matter, not just to us, but to everyone we touch. And it tells us that no matter what happens at the end of this life, one thing is certain: we are far more than just our bodies. For most people who have an NDE, it all begins with an out-of-body experience, an event so startling, so disorienting, yet so liberating that it completely upends everything they thought they knew about life and death. Imagine for a moment that you've just suffered a heart attack or been in a terrible accident. One moment you're in agony, and then Suddenly, the pain vanishes. You feel light. You feel free. But something isn't quite right. You glance downward and see a crowd gathering. There are doctors, nurses, or maybe a team of paramedics working frantically. People are crying, shouting, moving with urgency, and then it hits you. You're looking at your own body. At first, many NDEers don't even recognize themselves. They see a lifeless form lying there, but the perspective is all wrong. They are above the scene, looking down from the ceiling. Some say they feel completely detached, as if watching someone else's crisis unfold. Others panic, trying to reconnect with their body, only to realize that they can't. But once the initial shock wears off, something incredible happens. A rush of joy and freedom floods in. They realize that they are still themselves, fully conscious, fully aware, but no longer confined to a physical form. This new body they find themselves in isn't made of flesh and blood, yet it feels more real than the one they just left behind. It can move effortlessly through walls and doors, see through objects, and even travel instantly to any location simply by thinking about it. Seth describes this form as the same one we use during out-of-body experiences in life. We are, he explains, already spirit beings, simply clothed in flesh for a time. But when we leave the body behind, we find that this non-physical self has been interwoven with our physical existence all along. We just weren't aware of it. Naturally, many NDEers, in their state of newly found freedom, try to interact with the world they just left behind. They may attempt to pick up objects, wave at loved ones, or tap someone on the shoulder, but nothing happens. Their hands pass through walls. They speak, but no one hears. They are invisible to the world of the living, yet they can still perceive everything, and often they perceive more than they could before. They see and hear not only what's happening in the room, but sometimes in distant locations. The patient in surgery, floating above the operating table, might overhear a conversation in the waiting room down the hall. Others travel outside the hospital, visiting loved ones, even observing events that are later verified. This is where things get especially problematic for materialism, because if consciousness is just an illusion created by the brain, how is it possible for a clinically dead person to accurately describe conversations, locations, or objects they should have no way of knowing about? One of the most famous cases of verifiable out-of-body perception comes from a woman named Maria, who had a cardiac arrest while in the hospital. During her NDE, she reported leaving her body and floating outside the hospital building, and that's when she saw it. Perched on the third-floor ledge outside a window was a tennis shoe. It was in a strange position. Its little toe had worn a hole and its lace was caught under the heel. After Maria was revived, she told a hospital worker, Kim Clark, about the shoe and asked her to check if it was real. Clark was skeptical. She went outside, looked up at the third-floor ledge, but couldn't see anything. The angle was all wrong. She went upstairs, searching room by room, pressing her face against the narrow windows until finally she saw it. The shoe was exactly as Maria had described, but here's the catch. The only way Maria could have seen it from that angle, with the lace caught under the heel and the hole in the toe, was if she had been floating right outside the window. This wasn't a hallucination. It wasn't a dream. It was an event verified by an external witness. And it wasn't an isolated case. A study conducted by J.M. Holden and colleagues reviewed 93 cases of verifiable out-of-body perceptions during NDEs. The results were staggering. 92% were completely accurate, 6% contained minor errors, and only 1 was completely incorrect. What makes the out-of-body experience even more mind-blowing is that people who are blind from birth, who have never seen anything in their lives, can see during their NDEs. Take the case of Vicky, a 22-year-old woman blind from birth. She was in a severe car accident and suffered a skull fracture. After being taken to the hospital, she suddenly found herself hovering above a body on a gurney. At first, she didn't recognize it, but then she noticed a wedding ring, one she had only ever known by touch. That's when she realized the body was hers. But how was this possible? Vicky had never seen anything before. Not light, not darkness, not shapes or shadows. Yet during her NDE, she not only saw herself, but described trees, birds, and people made of light, all with a clarity she had never known before. And she's not alone. Cases of deaf people hearing and blind people seeing during NDEs challenge everything we think we know about perception. If vision and hearing are merely functions of the brain, then how do people with non-functioning sensory organs suddenly have these experiences? Seth's explanation offers an answer. Consciousness does not rely on the physical senses. Instead, it uses what he calls the inner senses, a direct mode of perception that doesn't depend on eyes, ears, or even a brain. These inner senses exist all the time, but they are drowned out by our reliance on the physical senses. When the body is temporarily set aside, as in an NDE, these inner senses take over, and people experience reality in an entirely new way. This explains why vision is sharper in NDEs, why colors never seen before appear, and why people report seeing through walls or perceiving things at great distances. Consciousness is simply operating without the constraints of a biological machine. Sometimes an out-of-body experience isn't just a one-time event. It can carry over into another life. Take the case of Rashid, a young man in Beirut, Lebanon. In July 1968, Rashid was in a car with his friend Ibrahim, speeding down the road. When Ibrahim tried to overtake another car, he lost control. The vehicle flipped multiple times and Rashid was thrown free of the car and killed. "I flew out of the car and landed on my head," he later recalled. When help finally arrived, Rashid remembers hearing people talking and moving about, preparing to remove the injured. When they came to his body, he remembers them saying, "Leave this one, he's dead." Now, fast forward 18 months, a little boy named Daniel is born. As soon as he can talk, he begins telling his parents that they are not his real parents. His name, he insists, is Rashid. He recalls dying in a car crash, describes the exact events leading up to it, and even identifies people from Rashid's life, people he had never met in this one. This case was one of over 2,500 documented by psychiatrist Ian Stevenson, involving children who claim to remember past lives. These children recall details they could not have possibly known, describe places they have never been, and even identify family members from their previous incarnation. Stevenson, who spent decades studying these cases, concluded that a rational person could believe in reincarnation based on the evidence. So what does all this mean? It means that consciousness does not belong to the brain. It is not produced by physical matter. Instead, it is independent, non-local, and capable of existing beyond the body. And if it can do that, then what does that say about what happens after we die? In our next episode, we'll continue our deep dive into the 12 core elements of the near-death experience, from the life review to the mysterious border that must not be crossed. If NDEs are a preview of what awaits us, then understanding them might just be the key to understanding our true nature. Stay with us, because the adventure is far from over. Remember to like and subscribe. See you next time.